Hey, welcome to Horror Ecos. Before we start, just a quick note. After the first few minutes, the rest of the video plays without breaks. So get comfortable and give it a try. I think you'll enjoy these stories. If you do, you can like and subscribe. Only if you really want to. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time it is for you? I read them every night. All right, let's begin tonight's story. Story start now. The ghost slapped his girlfriend across the face after she mocked my cousin for believing in spirits. She laughed at him for believing in ghosts. Called him crazy for thinking a spirit was moving objects around his rented farmhouse. And then something invisible struck her so hard across the face that it left a bright red handprint on her cheek. That is the moment everything changed. The instant when mockery turned to terror. When skepticism was replaced by undeniable physical proof that something in that house was not only real but was capable of violence when disrespected. My cousin had been living peacefully with whatever presence occupied the farmhouse for months, following the simple rule he had been given. Leave the spirit alone and it will leave you alone. But his girlfriend had broken that rule. She had laughed. She had mocked. She had declared that ghosts did not exist while standing in a house where a ghost was listening. And the ghost had responded, not with a subtle sign or an ambiguous event that could be explained away, with a slap. A physical, undeniable, witnessed assault that left a mark on her face and terror in both their hearts. This is my cousin's story, but I am telling it because he has given me permission to share it and because I think it contains important lessons about respect and boundaries and the consequences of dismissing things we do not understand. What happened in that farmhouse was real. The evidence was documented. Multiple people witnessed the phenomena. And the ending, the violent escalation that drove my cousin and his girlfriend out of the house and led eventually to the building being torn down, demonstrates that some hauntings are not benign, are not safely ignored, and will respond with force when provoked. Let me start from the beginning, from the moment my cousin first rented the farmhouse and had no idea what he was moving into. My cousin had gotten a new job in a rural area, the kind of place where housing options are limited and you take what you can find that is affordable and reasonably close to your workplace. He was not looking for anything fancy or luxurious. He just needed a place to live while he established himself in this new position and figured out whether the job and the location were going to work out for him long term. He found a small farmhouse for rent. It was older. The kind of structure that had been built decades or maybe even a century earlier, with the solid construction and simple layout that characterized rural housing from that era. The property included some land, not a working farm anymore, but the remnants of what had once been agricultural property, with old outbuildings and fields that were now mostly overgrown. The rent was reasonable, maybe even a bit lower than he had expected for the amount of space and privacy the property offered. The landlord seemed eager to rent it to him, did not ask too many questions, moved quickly through the paperwork and the transaction. He took this as a positive sign, evidence that he had found a good deal and that the landlord was a straightforward person to work with. He moved in, brought his belongings, set up his furniture and his life in this new space. The first few days were normal. He went to work, came home, cooked meals, slept, followed the routines that anyone follows when adjusting to a new living situation. And then he started noticing things, small things at first. Objects that he remembered leaving in one place would be in a different place when he came home. Keys that he had set on the kitchen counter would be on the table. A book he had left on the arm of the couch would be on the bookshelf. Items in the bathroom would be rearranged, not dramatically, but enough that he noticed. He told himself he was forgetting where he put things, that he was distracted by the stress of the new job and the adjustment to a new environment, that his memory was not as reliable as he thought it was. These are the explanations we give ourselves when strange things start happening, the rational stories we tell to avoid confronting possibilities that make us uncomfortable. But the incidents continued, and they escalated from small rearrangements to more obvious displacements. He would come home and find cabinet doors open that he was certain he had closed. Drawers pulled out, chairs moved to different positions. The television remote in a completely different room from where he had left it. These were not things he could easily blame on his own forgetfulness. These were clear, undeniable changes to the environment that required someone or something to physically move objects while he was gone. His first thought was that the landlord was entering the house without his permission. This is a reasonable concern when you rent property. You have a right to privacy and security, and landlords are supposed to give notice before entering except in emergencies. The idea that his landlord might be coming into his home while he was at work, going through his things, moving his belongings, was both a violation of his privacy and potentially illegal depending on the terms of his lease. He decided to confront her about it. He called her, kept his tone neutral but firm, explained what he had been noticing, and asked directly if she had been entering the property while he was away. She said no, immediately and clearly. She was not coming into the house. She had no reason to enter without his permission, and she had not done so. But then, after that denial, she paused, and she told him there was something she needed to confess. Something important that she probably should have told him before he moved in, but had not because she was worried he would not rent the property if he knew. She told him the house was haunted. Not maybe haunted or possibly haunted, or some tenants have reported strange things. She stated it directly and matter-of-factly. The house was haunted. There was a spirit or spirits living there alongside whoever rented the property. She explained that there were Civil War soldiers buried on the land. The property had some historical significance, had been the site of an encampment or a battle or a field hospital. One of those places where young men had died far from home during that terrible conflict that tore America apart in the 1860s. Some of those soldiers had been buried where they fell, and over the years those graves had been forgotten, the markers lost or removed, the exact locations unknown. She believed that one of those soldiers, or possibly more than one, had never left, that their spirits remained attached to the property, moving through the house, interacting with the physical world in small but noticeable ways. My cousin listened to this explanation, and he did not believe a single word of it. He was a practical person, someone who dealt in facts and evidence, who did not put stock in ghost stories or supernatural explanations for things that probably had perfectly ordinary causes. The idea that a Civil War ghost was moving his belongings around seemed ridiculous. The kind of story you would tell children to scare them, or use as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for something. He thanked his landlord for the information, ended the call, and decided he was going to find out what was really happening. Because if she was not entering the house, then someone else was. Maybe there was a door that did not lock properly. Maybe a neighbor had a key. Maybe there was some explanation that involved living humans rather than dead soldiers. He installed cameras inside the home. Small security cameras that could record continuously or be triggered by motion. The kind of equipment that has become affordable and accessible in recent years for anyone who wants to monitor their property. He set them up in the main living areas where he had noticed the most activity, positioned them to capture as much of the space as possible, and configured them to upload footage to cloud storage so he would have a record even if someone found and disabled the cameras themselves. And then he went out of town for a week. A work trip that required him to be away from the property, leaving the house empty and the cameras recording whatever might happen in his absence. When he returned and reviewed the footage, what he saw stopped his skepticism dead in its tracks. Objects were moving. Not because anyone was touching them. Not because of wind or vibration or any physical force that the cameras could detect. They just moved. Doors opening on their own. Items sliding across tables or counters. Books falling from shelves when nothing had touched them. He watched the footage over and over, looking for explanations, checking for strings or hidden mechanisms or any trick that might account for what he was seeing. But there was nothing. Just objects defying physics, moving in ways that required force but showed no source for that force. The cameras had documented exactly what the landlord had told him. The house was haunted. Whatever was in there was real and was capable of interacting with physical objects in ways that my cousin could not explain or rationalize away. This put him in a difficult position. He had just moved in, had paid first and last month's rent and a security deposit, had invested time and money into setting up his life in this location. The job was good and he wanted to keep it. Finding another place to live would be expensive and disruptive. But he was also now certain that he was sharing his home with something that should not exist according to everything he had been taught about how reality worked. He remembered that one of his friends knew a paranormal investigator, someone who studied and dealt with hauntings professionally. He reached out, explained the situation, and asked if this person could come evaluate his house and tell him what he was dealing with. The paranormal investigator came, did whatever tests and evaluations and spiritual assessments that people in that field do, used equipment to detect electromagnetic fields or temperature changes or whatever other signs they believe indicate supernatural presence. And after completing the investigation, the person gave my cousin both good news and instructions. The good news was that the spirit or spirits in the house were not malevolent. They were not trying to harm him. They were simply there, existing alongside him, occasionally moving things around either out of curiosity or some need to interact with the physical world, or perhaps just because that is what they had always done, and they saw no reason to stop. The instructions were simple and clear. Leave the spirit alone, and it would leave him alone. Do not try to communicate with it. Do not try to banish it or cleanse the house or perform any kind of intervention. Just coexist peacefully, tolerate the minor inconveniences of objects being moved, and everything would be fine. This seemed like a reasonable arrangement to my cousin. He was not afraid of something that was not trying to hurt him. He could live with things being moved around if that was the price of staying in a house that was otherwise perfectly functional and affordable. So he decided to stay, and for a while this arrangement worked well. He adjusted to the reality of living in a haunted house. When he came home and found things moved, he just put them back where they belonged and did not make a big deal about it. He followed the rule he had been given. Left the spirit alone, did not try to engage with it or acknowledge it or treat it as anything other than a quirk of the property he happened to rent. Months passed. Life continued normally, or as normally as life can continue when you are sharing your home with a ghost who occasionally rearranges your furniture. And then my cousin started dating a woman. They had met through work or through friends. I do not remember the exact details of how the relationship began, but it developed into something serious enough that she started spending time at his house. Staying over occasionally, being present in the space, noticing things about the environment. She started commenting on the fact that things seemed to move around. She would set her purse down in one place and find it in another. She would leave her shoes by the door and discover them in a different room. Small things, the same kinds of occurrences my cousin had long since gotten used to, but new and notable to her because she did not yet know the explanation. Finally, she asked him about it directly. Why were things always being moved? Was he doing it? Was she going crazy? What was happening in this house? My cousin decided to tell her the truth. He explained about the landlord's warning, about the cameras he had installed, about the footage that showed objects moving on their own, about the paranormal investigator who had confirmed the presence of a spirit and given instructions about how to coexist peacefully with it. He expected her to be concerned or frightened or at least curious. These are the normal reactions when someone tells you that the house you have been sleeping in is haunted by a Civil War soldier. But that is not how she reacted at all. She started laughing. Not a nervous laugh or an uncomfortable giggle, but genuine, full-throated laughter. The kind of laugh that makes it clear you think someone is telling you the most ridiculous thing you have ever heard. She told him he was crazy, that there was no such thing as ghosts, that he had imagined or misinterpreted everything he had experienced, that the footage he had shown her must have been faked or could be explained by normal causes, that the paranormal investigator was a fraud taking advantage of gullible people who wanted to believe in the supernatural. She mocked him, openly and repeatedly, made fun of him for believing in ghosts, for taking the landlord's warning seriously, for paying someone to investigate his house, for thinking that a dead Civil War soldier was moving his belongings around. My cousin tried to get her to take it seriously, to understand that he had documented evidence, that multiple people had verified what was happening. But she would not listen. She just kept laughing, kept insisting that ghosts were not real, kept treating him like he was foolish or delusional for believing otherwise. They were in the living room having this conversation. She was still laughing, still mocking him, still declaring loudly that there were no such things as ghosts, and that my cousin was crazy for thinking there were. And then my cousin walked into the kitchen for something. A drink of water, a snack, some mundane reason that took him out of the living room for just a moment. He heard a slap, a sharp, clear, unmistakable sound.
the sound of a hand striking flesh with force, and then he heard his girlfriend scream. She came running into the kitchen, her face showing shock and pain and terror all mixed together. She was touching her face, specifically her right cheek, and when my cousin looked at her, he could see that the cheek was bright red, not flushed red from emotion or embarrassment. Bright red in the specific pattern of a handprint, the kind of mark that appears on skin when it has been struck hard enough to cause immediate inflammation and blood flow to the surface.
She was stammering, trying to explain what had just happened, but barely able to form coherent words. Something had slapped her, something she could not see. She had been standing in the living room, alone, still laughing about how my cousin believed in ghosts. And then suddenly there had been a sharp pain on her face, and the impact had been hard enough to knock her head to the side. Someone or something had hit her, hard, while she was alone in the room. My cousin looked at her face, at the clear handprint on her cheek, at the terror in her eyes that replaced all the mockery and skepticism she had been expressing just moments before. And he understood immediately what had happened. The spirit that had been peacefully coexisting with him for months, following the unspoken agreement to leave him alone as long as he left it alone, had been listening to his girlfriend mock and laugh and declare that ghosts did not exist. And the spirit had taken offense, had decided that this disrespect, this mockery, this loud insistence that it did not exist, required a response. So it had responded in the most undeniable way possible. It had slapped her, had demonstrated its existence and its capacity for violence in a single shocking action. They both ran out of the house, did not stop to grab belongings, did not pause to lock the door, did not discuss or debate or try to rationalize what had just happened. They just ran, got into my cousin's car, and drove away from the property as fast as they could. My cousin never went back, not even to retrieve his belongings. He was done with that house, done with the spirit that lived there, done with the entire situation. He paid someone else to go into the house and pack up his things and bring them to wherever he was staying temporarily. He forfeited his security deposit, broke his lease, absorbed whatever financial penalties came with abandoning a rental property mid-contract. Because nothing about that house was worth the risk of another encounter with whatever had slapped his girlfriend hard enough to leave a mark. He found out later, through conversations with the landlord or through neighborhood gossip, that he was not the first person to have a violent encounter with the spirit in that house. The landlord's grandson had been attacked at some point in the past. The details were not clear, but apparently the assault had been serious enough to convince the landlord that the property was not safe to rent anymore. She eventually made the decision to tear down the house. Not to renovate it or cleanse it or try any spiritual intervention to remove the spirit. Just to destroy the physical structure entirely, reduce it to rubble, erase the building from existence. And after the house was gone, after the last remnants of whatever history and tragedy and death had occurred there had been demolished and hauled away, she sold the property. Sold it as vacant land, with no mention of hauntings or spirits or Civil War soldiers, passing the problem along to someone else, or perhaps believing that removing the house had freed whatever had been trapped there. My cousin never found out exactly what happened after that. He moved on with his life, found new housing, tried to forget about the months he had spent living with a ghost. He and the girlfriend did not stay together long after the incident. The experience had been too traumatic, too divisive, too much a reminder of things neither of them wanted to think about. But he told me this story, and he gave me permission to share it, because he wants people to understand something important. Ghosts are real. The spirit in that farmhouse was real. The footage on the cameras was real. And the slap that left a handprint on his girlfriend's face was real. And more importantly, these spirits have boundaries and expectations about how they should be treated. The paranormal investigator had told my cousin to leave the spirit alone, and it would leave him alone. That was the rule, the agreement, the terms of coexistence. My cousin had followed that rule and had lived peacefully in the house for months without incident. But his girlfriend had violated that rule. She had not just disbelieved in the spirit, which might have been tolerable. She had mocked it, had laughed at the very idea of its existence, had declared loudly and repeatedly that it was not real while standing in the house where it lived, and the spirit had defended itself, had asserted its existence, but demonstrated that it was real and that it could hurt her if it chose to. This is the lesson my cousin wants people to learn from his experience.
If you find yourself living in a haunted house, if you encounter evidence of spirits or entities that should not exist according to conventional understanding of reality, treat them with respect. You do not have to believe in them. You do not have to understand them. You do not have to like them or welcome them or try to communicate with them. But you need to respect them. You need to acknowledge their boundaries. You need to follow whatever rules or agreements are established for coexisting peacefully. Because they are real. They exist. And they can hurt you if you push them too far. My cousin's girlfriend learned this lesson the hard way, with a handprint on her face in terror that will probably stay with her for the rest of her life. The rest of us can learn it the easy way, by listening to stories like this and taking them seriously. I do not know what happened to the spirit after the house was torn down. I do not know if destroying the building freed it to move on to wherever spirits go when they are no longer tied to physical locations. I do not know if it found peace, or if it is still attached to that land, still angry, still waiting for the next person who will mock its existence and need to be taught a lesson. What I know is that my cousin is grateful to be alive and unharmed. Grateful that he followed the rules he was given and was spared the kind of violent encounter that his girlfriend and the landlord's grandson experienced. And I know that I will never mock someone who tells me their house is haunted. I will never laugh at claims of supernatural experiences or dismiss evidence of ghosts as imagination or fraud. Because I have seen the photograph of my cousin's girlfriend's face with that bright red handprint on her cheek. I have heard the story directly from someone I trust completely. I know this happened exactly as described, and I have no desire to be the next person who learns through painful experience that ghosts are real and that they demand respect. So this is my cousin's story. This is his warning. This is his testimony that the supernatural exists and that it can hurt you if you treat it carelessly. The ghost slapped her across the face, left a mark, demonstrated its power and its willingness to use violence when mocked. And then the house where it lived was torn down and the property was sold and everyone involved moved on with their lives. But the lesson remains. The truth remains. The evidence remains. Respect the spirits. Leave them alone if they ask to be left alone. Do not mock them or deny their existence or treat them with contempt. Because they are listening, and they can respond. And that response might be the last thing you ever experience. My cousin's girlfriend is lucky. She walked away with just a slap and a story to tell. Others have not been so fortunate. The landlord's grandson was attacked. Others before my cousin had experiences bad enough that they fled the property. And now the house is gone, torn down, erased from the landscape as if it never existed. But the story remains, and the warning remains. And I am sharing it now so that you can learn from my cousin's experience without having to go through it yourself. Ghosts are real. Respect them. And never ever mock them while standing in their house. Because they are listening, and they will make you regret it. Next one story start now. I saw a woman with a broken jaw and sunken eyes standing outside my fast food restaurant window. The woman's face was wrong in ways I cannot fully describe. Her jaw hanging at an angle that no living person's jaw should hang, her eyes set so far back in their sockets that they looked like they belonged to a skull rather than a living face. And when I screamed and my coworkers checked the security cameras, there was no one there. That is the image that has burned itself into my memory. The face that I see when I close my eyes at night. The reason I can no longer work alone in the restaurant where I am employed. I know how this sounds. I know that saying your workplace is haunted, especially when that workplace is a fast food restaurant, sounds ridiculous. It sounds like the kind of story teenagers tell each other to be dramatic. The kind of thing you dismiss immediately because fast food restaurants are not the setting for ghost stories. They are brightly lit, constantly occupied. Thoroughly mundane spaces where the most frightening thing is usually an angry customer or a broken ice cream machine. But I am telling you, with complete sincerity and total certainty, that the restaurant where I work is haunted. And the entity that haunts it is not a vague presence or a shadowy figure glimpsed in peripheral vision. It is a woman with a face that suggests violence and death and suffering so terrible that she could not fully leave this world even after her body stopped functioning. I need to tell you this story from the beginning, from the first incident that made me realize something was wrong in that building. Because the haunting did not start with the woman at the window.
It started with smaller things, stranger things. Events that I tried to explain away until the explanations stopped working, and I had to confront the reality of what I was experiencing. I work at a fast food restaurant. I am not going to tell you which chain or exactly where it is located because I still work there and I do not want to cause problems for my employer or get fired for talking publicly about the fact that the building is haunted. But it is a standard fast food operation, the kind you see on every major road in America, with a drive-through and a dining room, and a kitchen where we prepare the same menu items that have been served at thousands of identical locations for decades. My job involves all the usual fast food tasks: taking orders, preparing food, restocking supplies, cleaning, doing whatever needs to be done to keep the operation running smoothly through the constant flow of customers who want cheap, quick meals. It is not glamorous work and it is not particularly interesting work, but it pays my bills and fits my schedule, and I have worked there long enough to be reasonably good at what I do. Part of my regular routine involves restocking the toppings. We have a topping bar or preparation area where we keep all the vegetables and condiments and other items that go on sandwiches or burgers or whatever we happen to be making. These toppings need to be replenished constantly throughout the day as they get used up. So checking levels and bringing fresh supplies from the back is something I do multiple times per shift. I was doing exactly that, working through my mental checklist of what needed to be restocked, when I heard a crash from the back of the restaurant. It was loud and sharp, the unmistakable sound of something falling and hitting the ground hard, the kind of noise that makes you immediately think someone has been hurt. I rushed toward the sound, moving as quickly as I could through the kitchen area toward the back where we keep supplies and do prep work. My first thought was that one of my coworkers had dropped something heavy or had slipped and fallen, that I was about to find someone injured and needing help. When I got to the back, I found that a dish had fallen. Not just any dish, but one that had been secured to a wall-mounted rack, the kind of storage system we use to keep cooking equipment organized and accessible. The dish was on the floor, intact but clearly having fallen from a height based on the sound it had made. But here is what made this strange, what made it something more than just a normal accident. The way our wall racks work, you cannot just knock a dish off them. The design includes a lip or edge that prevents items from sliding off accidentally. To remove a dish from these racks, you have to deliberately lift it up and over that lip, pulling up on it before you can take it down. There is no way for a dish to fall from one of these racks unless someone physically removes it and then drops it or throws it. Gravity alone cannot make it fall. Vibration or bumping cannot make it fall. It is specifically designed to prevent exactly that kind of accident. And yet, here was a dish on the floor, having obviously fallen from the rack where it had been stored. My manager had also heard the sound and come to investigate. We looked at each other, both of us trying to figure out what had happened. I asked, "Did you drop something?" She said, "No, did you?" Neither of us had been near the dish rack. Neither of us had any explanation for how this secured dish had managed to end up on the floor. We looked at the rack, checked if it was loose or damaged in some way that might explain the incident. Everything was solid. The rack was firmly attached to the wall. The lip that was supposed to prevent items from falling was intact and functioning as designed. We could not figure out how it had happened, so we did what people usually do with unexplained events. We shrugged it off. We washed the dish, made sure it was not damaged, and placed it back in its spot on the rack. And then we went back to work, pushing the incident to the back of our minds, categorizing it as one of those weird things that sometimes happen for no apparent reason. A few days passed. The dish incident faded from my immediate attention, buried under the constant flow of tasks and customers and routine that makes up a shift at a fast food restaurant. Life continued normally, or at least as normally as working in fast food can be. We were in the middle of what would turn out to be a significant shift, though I did not know that yet. My coworkers had all gone outside for a smoke break. This is something that happens regularly in food service. People who smoke need their breaks, and often multiple employees will go out at the same time so they can socialize while they smoke, turning the nicotine break into a small moment of community and stress relief. I do not smoke, which means I do not participate in these breaks. I stay inside and use the time when the restaurant is less crowded with staff to get caught up on tasks that are easier to do when you are not navigating around other people. Restocking is one of those tasks, so I was working on that, moving between the front area and the back, bringing supplies forward, checking inventory, doing the routine work that keeps a restaurant functional. I was focused on what I was doing, probably counting items or checking dates, or doing one of the dozen small tasks that make up restocking, when I felt someone tap my shoulder. It was a distinct sensation. Not a brush or an accidental contact, but a deliberate tap. The kind of touch that someone uses when they want to get your attention. The pressure was firm enough that I could feel exactly where on my shoulder it had landed. I glanced back immediately, expecting to see one of my coworkers who had come back inside early from their smoke break and wanted to tell me something or ask me a question. There was no one there. The space behind me was empty. I was alone in that section of the restaurant. I stared at the empty space for a moment, my brain trying to reconcile what I had felt with what I was seeing. The tap had been real. I had felt it clearly. But there was no one there who could have touched me. I shrugged it off. Told myself I had imagined it, or that my shirt had shifted in a way that felt like a tap, or that I had bumped into something without realizing it. The same kinds of explanations we give ourselves when something happens that does not quite make sense but is not dramatic enough to force us to confront alternative possibilities. I went back to work, trying to focus on the tasks at hand, rather than on the weird sensation of being tapped by no one. A few minutes later, there was a tap on the window. The window I am referring to is part of the restaurant structure, one of the windows that looks out toward the parking lot or the street, allowing customers to see in and staff to see out. It is not unusual for people to tap on windows to get attention, though it is generally considered rude and we are not supposed to respond to customers who do that, rather than coming to the proper ordering location. But I figured it was probably my boyfriend. His name is Dominic, and he has a habit of messing with me while I am at work sometimes, showing up and making faces through the window or trying to make me laugh or distract me. It is annoying but also kind of sweet. One of those relationship dynamics that is equal parts irritating and endearing. So when I heard the tap on the window, I assumed it was him trying to get a rise out of me. I walked over to the window and opened it, or at least positioned myself where I could see out clearly and respond. "It's not funny, Dominic," I called out, expecting to see him standing there grinning or trying to look innocent. No response. And more significantly, no Dominic. The area outside the window was empty. No one was standing there. No one was walking away. The space was just vacant. I looked around more carefully, scanning the parking lot and the surrounding area, thinking maybe he had ducked out of sight or was hiding behind something to extend the joke. Nothing. I could not see him anywhere. Could not see anyone who might have tapped on the window. I shrugged it off again, though I was starting to feel slightly uneasy. Two weird things in the span of a few minutes, both involving touches or sounds that seemed to have no source. But I was alone in the restaurant. All my coworkers were still outside smoking, and I had work to do. So I pushed down the unease and went back to my tasks. I was back to restocking, trying to focus, when I heard the tap again. Same window. Same deliberate sound of someone or something striking the glass to get attention. This time I ignored it. I decided that if it was Dominic, I was not going to give him the satisfaction of responding. If it was something else, I did not want to know. I just wanted to finish my work and have my coworkers come back inside so I would not be alone anymore. But the tapping did not stop. It repeated, not frantically or urgently, but with a steady, persistent rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, pause, tap. As if someone was standing outside the window, deliberately trying to get my attention and refusing to give up until I responded. Finally, despite my resolution to ignore it, I turned toward the window. I do not know what made me look. Maybe just the human inability to ignore something that is demanding your attention. Maybe some instinct that told me I needed to see what was causing this sound. And there was a woman standing outside the window. My first thought, my immediate reaction, was relief. There was actually someone there. This was not some inexplicable phenomenon or my imagination running wild. There was a real person outside the window who had been tapping on it. But that relief lasted only a fraction of a second, just long enough for my eyes to focus on the figure and my brain to begin processing what I was actually seeing. The woman looked wrong.
Profoundly, terribly wrong in ways that my conscious mind struggled to accept even as my body reacted with immediate primal fear. I work at a fast food restaurant, which means I see all kinds of people. I see families and business people and teenagers and elderly customers and everyone in between. I also see people who are struggling, people who are homeless or dealing with addiction or mental illness. The population that exists on the edges of society and sometimes comes into fast food restaurants because we are warm and cheap and will serve anyone who has money for food. I have seen people who are high on drugs, people whose faces and bodies show the damage of substance abuse and difficult lives. I thought I was familiar with what desperation and addiction and hard living look like on a human face. This woman was not one of them. She was not a living person who looked rough. She was something else entirely. Her jaw looked like it had been broken. Not recently broken with swelling and bruising that suggested a healing injury, but broken in a way that suggested it had been damaged and then never properly set, or had healed wrong, or was displaying the effects of trauma that had fundamentally changed the structure of her face. It hung at an angle that was not natural, that made me understand immediately that this face had been subjected to violence. Her eyes were sunken back into her skull. Not just deeply set the way some people's eyes are as a natural feature, but receded so far back that they looked like they belonged to a corpse that had been dead long enough for the soft tissues to begin deteriorating. They were shadows and hollows, watching me from depths that should not exist in a living face. I screamed. Screamed bloody murder, as the saying goes. Screamed with every bit of air in my lungs, the kind of scream that comes from pure terror. From seeing something that violates every expectation about what reality should look like. My coworkers heard my scream and came rushing inside from their smoke break. They burst through the door asking what was wrong, what had happened, whether I was hurt or in danger. I was shaking, barely able to form words, trying to explain what I had just seen. The woman at the window, the broken jaw, the sunken eyes. The face that looked like death itself was staring at me through the glass. They ran to the window to look, to see what I was talking about, to confront whatever had frightened me so badly. There was nothing there. The space outside the window was empty. No woman with a broken jaw. No figure at all. Just the normal parking lot and street view that we see 100 times a shift. They checked around the building, looking for anyone who might have been there, and walked away. They checked inside the restaurant to make sure no one had somehow entered without us noticing. They pulled up the security camera footage to see what the cameras had captured during the time when I had been screaming. Nothing. The cameras showed me working alone, showed me looking at the window, showed me screaming. But they showed no figure outside the window. No woman. No person at all in the area where I had seen her standing. My coworkers did not know what to say. They could see that I was genuinely terrified, that I was not making this up or playing a joke. But they had no explanation for what I had experienced. The evidence, or lack of evidence, suggested that I had imagined the whole thing or hallucinated or mistaken something harmless for something frightening. But I know what I saw. I know the difference between a living person and what I saw at that window. I know the difference between imagination and the visceral, detailed, horrifying reality of a face that looked like it had been broken and had never healed properly. That face was real. That woman was real, or at least she appeared to me as real. And the terror I felt was the appropriate response to seeing something that should not exist standing outside my workplace staring at me through the glass. Since that day, I cannot be alone in the restaurant anymore. I physically cannot do it. If my coworkers want to take a smoke break, I go with them now even though I do not smoke. I stand outside and breathe secondhand smoke and tolerate whatever health consequences come with that because it is better, infinitely better, than being alone inside that building where something or someone appears at windows and taps on shoulders and knocks dishes off racks that are designed to prevent exactly that. I would rather risk the long-term effects of secondhand smoke than see that woman again, than see that broken jaw and those sunken eyes and that face that communicated suffering and death. And something that refused to leave this world even though it clearly no longer belonged here. My coworkers have started to believe me, even without seeing anything themselves. Because other things have happened since that day, small things mostly, sounds with no source, objects moving when no one is near them. The general feeling of being watched that multiple people have reported experiencing during closing shifts, when the restaurant is empty of customers and the staff is reduced to just a few people cleaning up. No one else has seen the woman at the window, at least not that they have admitted. But everyone knows that something is wrong with that building. Something happened there, some violence or tragedy or death that left a mark, that created or attracted or somehow manifested an entity that now shares the space with us.
I have tried to research the history of the location to find out if there were any deaths or assaults or traumatic events associated with the property. But fast food restaurants do not typically maintain public records of their darker moments. And the building has probably been demolished and rebuilt and repurposed multiple times over the years, making it difficult to trace what might have happened there decades ago. All I know is what I experienced, what I saw, what I continue to live with every time I go to work and have to walk past that window. Have to work in that back area where dishes fall from racks they should not fall from. Have to exist in a space that feels watched and inhabited by something that no one wants to acknowledge, but that everyone can sense at some level. I know how this sounds. I know that saying your fast food restaurant is haunted sounds stupid and dramatic, and like the kind of story that gets dismissed immediately. But I am telling you this story because it is true, because it happened to me, because that woman's face is something I will see for the rest of my life whether I want to or not. And I am telling you because I think there are probably other people working in other restaurants or retail locations or office buildings who have had similar experiences, who have seen things they cannot explain, who have felt presences that should not be there. And those people probably stay silent because they think no one will believe them, because they think their stories sound too ridiculous to be taken seriously. Because admitting that your workplace is haunted feels like admitting that you are crazy or attention-seeking or unable to distinguish reality from fiction. But you are not crazy. I am not crazy. The woman at the window was real. The tap on my shoulder was real. The dish falling from the rack was real. And if you are reading this and nodding along because you have experienced something similar in your own workplace, please know that you are not alone. There are places where the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than we want to admit. There are buildings that hold on to trauma and suffering and violence in ways that manifest as hauntings. There are faces that appear at windows that should not have faces appearing at them. I work at a fast food restaurant, and as stupid as it sounds, I swear it is haunted. Haunted by a woman with a broken jaw and sunken eyes who stands at the window and taps on the glass, and makes sure that anyone who sees her understands that death is not always the end, that some forms of suffering persist beyond the boundaries of life, that some presences refuse to leave even when their physical bodies have long since stopped functioning. I will probably never know who she was or what happened to her or why she appears at that particular window in that particular restaurant. But I know she is there. I know she is real. And I know that I will never work alone in that building again, no matter what it costs me in terms of convenience or comfort or my own health. Because nothing, absolutely nothing, is worth seeing that face again. The woman at the window with the broken jaw and the sunken eyes. She is still there, still tapping. Next one's story start now. The father was a butcher handling our food, and the mother was a nurse treating patients. And police found they had never used a toilet in 7 years. The townhouse where my classmate lived had to be condemned after police discovered that a family of 5, including a father who worked as a butcher at the grocery store where we shopped, and a mother who was a nurse at the local hospital, had spent 7 years defecating wherever they stood and wiping themselves on the corners of walls instead of using a toilet. That is the nightmare I need you to understand before I tell you the rest of this story, because the horror of what was discovered in that townhouse in Des Plaines, Illinois in 1973 or 1974 goes far beyond the physical disgust of the living conditions themselves. This was not just a story about a dirty house or a family with hygiene problems. This was a story about people who touched our food and treated our sick while living in conditions so unspeakable that grown men wearing gas masks vomited when they entered the building. This was a story about a mother who said she just got tired of cleaning and decided that for 7 years, an entire family would simply defecate and urinate wherever they happened to be standing, creating layers of human waste so thick that workers had to use jackhammers to remove them from the walls.
And we had no idea. None of us had any idea. We went to school with one of the children from that family. We sat in classrooms with him. We knew he smelled bad, knew there was something off about him, but we just assumed he was a dirty kid, the kind of unfortunate child who comes from a neglectful home where basic hygiene is not a priority. We made fun of him sometimes, the way children make fun of anyone who is different or smells bad or does not fit in with social norms. We avoided sitting near him. We held our noses when he walked by. But we had no idea what he was going home to every single day. No idea of the unimaginable horror that existed just a few blocks away from where many of us lived. No idea that the reason he smelled so bad was not simple neglect, but something far worse. Something that would make national news when it was finally discovered and would send our entire town into a panic about public health and safety, and how something like this could have gone unnoticed for so long. I need to tell you this story from the beginning. From my perspective as a child who went to school with this kid for years without understanding what his life was really like, because that perspective is important for grasping the full scope of how this situation could exist and persist in a normal American suburb in the 1970s. I was in 5th grade when I first encountered this boy. I will not use his real name because even though this story made national news and is a matter of public record, he was a child and a victim of circumstances he did not create, and I do not want to add to whatever trauma and stigma he has carried for the rest of his life. He was in my class. We were the same age, going through the same curriculum, sitting in the same classrooms, participating in the same activities that all 5th graders in our school district participated in. On the surface, he was just another kid, one face among dozens in the social landscape of elementary school. Except that he smelled badly. The kind of smell that you notice immediately when he enters a room, that lingers in the air after he leaves, that makes you want to breathe through your mouth instead of your nose if you have to sit anywhere near him. It was not the normal smell of a kid who needs a bath or who has been playing outside and gotten sweaty and dirty. It was something worse, something deeper, a smell that seemed to emanate from his clothes and his skin and his hair, a smell that no amount of distance or fresh air could fully neutralize. The teachers tried to handle it discreetly. They would seat him near windows that could be opened. They would find reasons to send him to the bathroom to wash his hands. They would occasionally pull him aside and talk to him quietly about personal hygiene, probably giving him the same gentle lectures they gave to any student who was not taking care of themselves properly. But nothing changed. He continued to smell. Day after day, week after week, month after month. The smell was a constant, a defining characteristic, the main thing that everyone knew about him even if they did not know his name. We all just assumed, because we were children and did not know better, that he was a dirty kid, that his parents did not care about cleanliness or did not have enough money for regular bathing or laundry, or that there was some kind of neglect happening that made him unable to maintain basic hygiene. These kinds of situations exist. There are children who come from homes where hygiene is not prioritized, where resources are limited, where parents are absent or overwhelmed or dealing with their own problems and the children suffer as a result. So we made assumptions. We avoided him when we could. We were not particularly kind about it, because children rarely are when confronted with someone who makes them uncomfortable. But we did not think it was our problem to solve. We just accepted that this was how things were and tried to minimize our own exposure to the smell that followed him everywhere he went. This continued through 5th grade, and 6th grade, and into 7th grade. 3 years of this boy coming to school every day smelling worse than any human being should smell, of teachers trying to address it gently and failing, of classmates avoiding him and making jokes about him behind his back. And then, around 7th grade, the rumblings started. I do not know who first started suggesting that something was seriously wrong, that the smell was not just about a kid who needed to take more showers, but was indicative of something darker and more disturbing happening in his home. Maybe it was a teacher who had finally seen or heard something that made them concerned. Maybe it was another parent who lived near the townhouses where his family lived and had noticed something off. Maybe it was just the accumulation of small details over time that finally reached a critical mass where people started asking questions. The townhouses where he lived had a reputation. This is relevant because it provides context for why people might have been slower to investigate or intervene. They were known as a rough area, a place where people who were struggling financially or socially or personally ended up living. The kind of housing complex where the police were called regularly, where domestic disputes and drug problems and other social issues were understood to be part of the normal background noise of the neighborhood. When you live in that kind of area, or when you know someone who lives there is sometimes a tendency to dismiss warning signs because you assume that whatever problems exist are just par for the course for that location. People who live in rough neighborhoods often have difficult lives. Their kids might come to school not as well cared for as kids from more affluent areas. And unless something rises to the level of obvious abuse or immediate danger, there is often a reluctance to get involved or make accusations that might make things worse. So even as the rumbling started, even as people began to suspect that something was very wrong in that family's home, nothing concrete happened immediately. No investigation was launched. No authorities intervened. It was just talk, speculation, concern that had not yet crystallized into action. I was 13 years old when my family moved. We did not move far, still within the same general area, but to a different neighborhood. This meant I was slightly removed from the immediate community where this boy's family lived, no longer walking past his townhouse complex, no longer embedded in the same daily geography. Exactly 1 week after we moved, the police entered the townhouse. I do not know what finally triggered the investigation. Whether it was a report from a concerned citizen, a mandatory welfare check, a complaint about the smell that neighbors must have been enduring, or something else entirely. But whatever the catalyst was, it resulted in police officers showing up at the family's townhouse and gaining entry to the property. What they discovered was so unspeakably disgusting, so far beyond anything that seems possible in a civilized society, that it made national news. The family of 5 had never used a toilet. Not in the recent past. Not for the last few months or year. Never. For the entire 7 years they had lived in that townhouse, not a single member of the family had used the toilet for its intended purpose. Instead, they had defecated and urinated wherever they happened to be standing at the moment they felt the urge. In the living room. In the bedrooms. In the kitchen. Anywhere and everywhere, just dropping their waste on the floor or against the walls, and then continuing with whatever they were doing, as if this was perfectly normal behavior. And for wiping themselves, instead of using toilet paper, they used the corners of the walls, rubbed themselves against the edges where 2 walls met, using the physical structure of the building as a substitute for the hygienic materials that every other person uses for this most basic biological function. For 7 years, this had been going on. 7 years of a family of 5 people defecating and urinating freely throughout the living space, never cleaning it up, never disposing of waste, never using the bathroom facilities that were right there in the home, installed and functional and available for use. The accumulation was beyond anything the police officers or the cleanup crews had ever encountered. The layers of feces on the walls were so thick, so hardened and compressed by time, that they could not be removed with normal cleaning equipment. Workers had to bring in jackhammers. Industrial jackhammers, the kind used to break up concrete, to chip away at the walls that were coated in years of dried human waste. And even with jackhammers and protective equipment and every precaution they could think of, the work was nearly impossible. The workers had to wear gas masks just to enter the building. Full respirators that filtered out the toxic air. Because breathing in that environment was not just unpleasant but potentially dangerous to their health. The ammonia from urine, the bacterial load from decomposing feces, the mold and mildew, and whatever other biological horrors had grown in that environment over 7 years. All of it created an atmosphere that was poisonous to breathe. And even with the gas masks, even with the doors thrown open to ventilate the space, workers were getting sick, vomiting, experiencing respiratory distress, having to take frequent breaks to step outside and recover before going back in for another attempt at cleaning this nightmare. The smell, when the doors were opened, filled the entire neighborhood. Not just the immediate townhouses on either side, but the entire surrounding area. An overpowering stench of human waste so concentrated and so pervasive that residents blocks away were calling to complain, were closing their windows and staying inside, were demanding to know what was happening and how long this horror would continue. The authorities made the only decision they could make, They condemned the entire building. Not just the one townhouse where this family had lived, but the entire structure, because the contamination was so severe that it had spread through walls and floors, had permeated the building materials themselves, had created a biohazard that could not be adequately cleaned or remediated. The building had to be destroyed, completely demolished. The only way to deal with the level of contamination was to tear down the structure and dispose of the materials as hazardous waste. But the physical horror of the living conditions was only part of the story.
The other part, the part that sent our entire town into a collective panic, was who these people were and what they did for a living.
The father was a butcher. He worked at a major chain grocery store, one of the big supermarkets where many families in our area did their regular shopping. He was there in the meat department, handling raw meat, cutting and packaging and preparing the products that people would take home and feed to their families. He was doing this with hands that had never touched soap in a home where toilets were never used, where fecal matter was spread on every surface, where basic sanitary practices did not exist.
Think about that. Really think about what it means.
This man would go home, live in unspeakable filth, defecate wherever he stood, wipe himself on a wall, and then the next day go to work and handle the food that other people would eat. He would touch the meat with hands that had touched feces. He would use the same fingers to package steaks and chicken and ground beef that he used to wipe himself in a home where toilet paper apparently did not exist. How many people got sick from contaminated meat that passed through his hands? How many stomach bugs and intestinal infections and food poisoning cases that were never traced to? Their source actually came from this one man working in this one store while living in these conditions.
We will never know the true extent of the damage.
Foodborne illness is common enough and difficult enough to trace that unless there is a massive outbreak that draws attention. Individual cases go unnoticed and unreported.
People assume they got sick from something they ate, they recover, or they see a doctor.
And they move on without ever knowing that what sickened them was the fact that a butcher who lived in a house full of human feces had handled their dinner. But the mother's situation was even worse in some ways, even more terrifying in its implications. She was a nurse. She worked at a major hospital in the area, one of the primary healthcare facilities that people went to for medical treatment. She was there treating patients, touching people who were already sick or injured or vulnerable, administering medications, dressing wounds, providing care that required cleanliness and sterility and adherence to basic infection control protocols. And she was going home to a house where she defecated on the floor and wiped herself on walls. She was living in conditions that would have shut down any hospital or medical facility if they existed there. She was carrying God knows what kind of bacteria and pathogens on her body and her clothing. And then she was going to work and touching patients who were depending on her to help them heal, not to infect them with diseases that should not exist in a modern medical setting.
How many hospital-acquired infections came from her?
How many patients developed complications or secondary illnesses or mysterious infections that could not be explained by their primary condition? How many people died because a nurse who was supposed to be helping them was carrying contamination from a home where human waste covered every surface? Again, we will never know the full extent. Hospital infections are common, often attributed to the general environment of a healthcare facility where sick people are concentrated and resistant bacteria proliferate.
Unless there is clear evidence of a specific source, individual cases of infection are just treated as unfortunate but not unusual events in medical care.
But knowing what we know now, knowing that for 7 years a nurse who worked at that hospital was living in conditions that would make a medieval dungeon look sanitary, the implications are staggering and horrifying. The town went into a frenzy when all of this became public knowledge. People who had shopped at that grocery store were questioning everything they had ever bought there. Parents whose children had been treated at that hospital were demanding records and investigations and explanations for any illness their kids had experienced that might have been related. There was talk of lawsuits, of health department investigations, of criminal charges for the parents who had created and maintained these conditions. The grocery store and the hospital both released statements. The father was immediately terminated from his position. The mother lost her nursing license and her job. Both institutions conducted internal investigations and brought in outside health inspectors to evaluate whether any ongoing contamination or risk existed in their facilities. The results of those investigations were never made fully public, at least not in detail. There were assurances that no evidence of contamination was found, that both facilities were safe, that the problem had been contained to the family's home and had not spread to their workplaces. But how could anyone truly believe that? How could anyone be certain that a man who lived in feces for 7 years was maintaining perfect hygiene at work? How could anyone trust that a nurse who wiped herself on walls was following proper hand washing and sterile technique protocols when treating patients? The answer is that you could not be certain. You could not trust those assurances. All you could do was hope that somehow, by some miracle of compartmentalization or basic self-preservation instinct, these two people had managed to keep their work lives separate from their home lives, had managed to function as sanitary professionals while living in conditions that defied all understanding of human behavior and basic hygiene. But I think we all knew, even if we did not want to admit it, that the separation was probably not perfect, that some contamination had almost certainly occurred, that people had probably gotten sick, that the damage had been done and could not be undone, could only be acknowledged and mourned and used as motivation to create better systems for identifying and intervening in situations like this before they reached such catastrophic proportions. The question that haunted everyone, the question that still haunts me decades later, is how did this happen? How did a family of 5 people, including 3 children, live in these conditions for 7 years without anyone stopping it? The mother, when she was interviewed by authorities and by the media that descended on the story, gave an explanation that was both simple and utterly inadequate. She said she got tired of cleaning. That was her reason. She got tired of cleaning the toilet, tired of the work involved in maintaining basic sanitation, and so she just stopped. Stopped using the toilet. Stopped cleaning anything. Stopped maintaining the most fundamental standards of human habitation. And somehow, instead of this decision lasting a day or a week or even a month before someone intervened, or before the family itself recognized how insane this was and returned to normal behavior, it lasted 7 years. 7 years of progressive deterioration, of filth accumulating, of conditions getting worse and worse until they reached the point where hazmat teams and jackhammers were required to even begin addressing the problem. The father apparently went along with this decision. The children, who had no choice in the matter, grew up thinking this was normal, or at least thinking they had no power to change it or escape it. The schools, despite having one of the children in their care 5 days a week, and certainly noticing that something was wrong, did not investigate deeply enough or intervene effectively enough to discover what was happening. The neighbors, who must have smelled something from that townhouse, who must have noticed that the family was strange or different or off in some way, either did not report it or reported it in ways that did not trigger an adequate response from authorities. The employers, who had these 2 people working in positions that required cleanliness and sanitary practices, somehow did not notice or did not act on whatever signs might have been present that something seriously wrong with their hygiene or their judgment or their basic functioning as responsible adults. The systems that are supposed to protect children and protect public health failed completely and comprehensively. And the result was 7 years of horror for the children who lived in that house, and unknown amounts of illness and potential death for the people who came into contact with the parents through their work. I think about the boy I went to school with, the one who smelled so bad that we all avoided him, and I feel a complicated mixture of guilt and pity and horror. Guilt because we made fun of him, because we treated him as a joke or a nuisance, rather than recognizing him as a victim of something terrible. Pity because his entire childhood was spent in conditions that no child should have to endure, and because whatever trauma that caused will stay with him for the rest of his life. Horror because I sat in classrooms with him, breathed the same air, touched the same doorknobs and desks, and I have to wonder what I was exposed to without knowing it. I do not know what happened to the family after the townhouse was condemned and the parents lost their jobs. I assume the children were removed from the home and placed in foster care or with relatives. I assume there were criminal charges filed, though I do not remember hearing about a trial or a conviction. I assume the family scattered, tried to start over somewhere else, carried the shame and the trauma of this event with them wherever they went. I do not know if the boy I went to school with ever recovered psychologically from growing up in those conditions. I do not know if he was able to build a normal life as an adult,
or if the damage was too severe and too permanent to overcome. I hope he got help. I hope he found people who understood that he was a victim and not a perpetrator. I hope he was able to separate himself from his parents' choices and create his own identity that was not defined by the worst thing that ever happened to him. But I will never forget the story. Never forget the boy who smelled bad. Never forget the national news coverage of a family that lived without using a toilet for 7 years.
Never forget the panic that swept through our town when people realized that the butcher and the nurse who touched their food and cared for their sick had been living in unspeakable filth. This happened in Des Plaines, Illinois in 1973 or 1974.
It was real. It was documented. It made national news. And it stands as one of the most disturbing examples I know of how people can exist in civilized society while living in conditions that seem impossible, how systems can fail to protect the vulnerable, and how the consequences of one family's dysfunction can ripple out to affect an entire community. The father was a butcher handling our food. The mother was a nurse treating our sick. And for 7 years they lived in a house where no one used a toilet and everyone defecated on the floor and wiped themselves on walls. That is the truth. That is what happened. And it is a nightmare that our town has never fully recovered from or forgotten.
Next one's story start now. My sister said she was drowning with her old family.
But we are her only family. My little sister woke up screaming every single night from before she could even talk. And when she finally learned enough words to describe her nightmare, she told me she was on a sinking boat with her family. But then she looked at me and said, I sent you and Mom. It's my old family. That is the sentence that has haunted me for years, the words that came out of a child barely old enough to form complete thoughts, describing something she could not possibly have experienced in the few short years of her current life. My old family. Not a family she had seen in a movie or a book or a story someone told her. Her old family. As if she had lived before, as if she had died before, as if the life she was living now with me and our mother was not her first life, but her second. And the memories of how the first one ended were so traumatic that they followed her into this new existence, as recurring nightmares that destroyed her sleep and filled her with terror night after night after night. I need to tell you this story carefully and completely, because the strangeness of what my sister experienced, and what she said, and what happened afterward when the nightmares simply stopped as mysteriously as they had begun, raises questions about consciousness and memory and whether death is truly the end or simply a transition to something else. I do not have answers to those questions. I only have the experience itself, the words my sister spoke, and the years I have spent trying to understand what they meant.
My sister was born when I was already old enough to remember her arrival clearly, to understand what it meant to have a new sibling, to take on some of the responsibility of being an older brother to a baby who would depend on me and look up to me as she grew. I was excited about her birth, had helped prepare for it, had imagined what it would be like to have a little sister to teach and protect and play with. She was a beautiful baby, healthy and normal in every way that the doctors could measure. She ate well, gained weight appropriately, met all the developmental milestones that babies are supposed to meet in their first months of life. There was nothing about her physical health or her behavior during the day that suggested anything was wrong or unusual. But at night, she had nightmares. This started before she could talk, before she had language to describe what she was experiencing, before she was old enough to have been exposed to media or stories or information that might have planted frightening images in her developing mind. She would wake up crying, not the normal fussing or discomfort that all babies experience, not the communication of hunger or a wet diaper or some other physical need, but crying that sounded like terror, like genuine distress, like something had frightened her so badly that sleep was no longer possible and she needed immediate comfort and protection. Every night this happened. Not occasionally or randomly, but every single night with the kind of consistency that ruled out coincidence or normal infant sleep disruptions. Whatever was happening in her dreams was happening regularly and predictably, a nightly visitation of something that terrified her. She would stand in her crib and cry until someone came. At first, when she was very young, our mother would respond, would go to her and pick her up and try to soothe her back to sleep. But as my sister got a little older, and as I became old enough to share a bedroom with her, instead of her staying in our mother's room,
The task of responding to her night terrors often fell to me. I would wake up to the sound of her crying, would climb out of my own bed and go to her crib, would see her standing there, gripping the bars, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking with sobs. And I would lift her out of the crib and bring her to my bed, let her sleep next to me where she felt safe enough to calm down and eventually drift back into sleep. This became our nightly routine. Me waking to her cries, lifting her from the crib, holding her until the fear subsided, letting her share my bed because it was the only way she could rest peacefully. Our mother knew this was happening and allowed it because nothing else seemed to work, because leaving my sister to cry alone in her crib was not something any of us could tolerate, and because having me there to respond meant our mother could get some sleep herself. As my sister grew older and began developing language, began learning words and how to string them together into sentences that communicated meaning, I started asking her about the nightmares. I wanted to understand what was frightening her so badly every night. I wanted to know if there was something we could do to make the dreams stop, some way to address whatever was causing this nightly terror. At first, her language was not developed enough for her to explain. She could say she was scared, could say she had a bad dream, but could not provide details or describe what she was actually experiencing in those dreams. But eventually, when she was probably 3 or maybe 4 years old enough to have a vocabulary that allowed for more complex communication, I asked her directly to tell me about the nightmare, to describe what she saw when she closed her eyes at night, what happened in the dream that made her so frightened. And what she told me made my blood run cold. She said, "I'm on a boat, and the boat is sinking. My family is there on the boat, but it isn't you and Mom. It's my old family." I made her repeat it, made sure I had heard correctly, that I was understanding what she was trying to communicate. And she said it again with the same basic elements. A boat, the boat's sinking. Her family with her, but not her current family. Her old family. I took her to our mother immediately, had her repeat the description of her nightmare so our mother could hear it directly from my sister's own mouth, could confirm that I was not misunderstanding or adding my own interpretation to what she was saying. Our mother heard the same thing I had heard. The same impossible, inexplicable statement from a child who should not have had the concepts or experiences to even formulate such ideas. We questioned my sister carefully, trying to understand where this dream might be coming from. Had she seen something on television about a sinking boat? We controlled what she watched carefully and could not think of any program or movie she might have been exposed to that would have planted this image. Had someone told her a story about a boat sinking? No one we knew had told her such a story. The adults in her life were careful about the kinds of stories and information they shared with a young child, and a traumatic event like a shipwreck was not something anyone would have thought appropriate to discuss with a toddler. Had she overheard a conversation or seen something in a book or been exposed to this information in some other way we were not aware of? We could not think of any source, any exposure, any explanation for how she would have developed this specific nightmare about drowning on a sinking boat with people she referred to as her family, but who were not actually her family. And that phrase, "my old family," was the most disturbing part, because it implied a level of understanding about existence and identity that a 3 or 4-year-old child should not possess. It implied that she understood herself to have had a previous family, a previous life, a previous existence that had ended in some kind of tragedy. We asked her what she meant by old family. Who were these people? Could she describe them? Did she know their names? She could not provide details. Or perhaps she could not articulate them in a way that we could understand. She was still very young, still developing language, still learning how to translate her internal experiences into words that other people could comprehend. All she could tell us was that they were her family from before, that they were with her on the boat, and that the boat was sinking and everyone was going to die. My mother and I discussed this at length when my sister was not present. We tried to make sense of it using every framework we had available. Was this just a nightmare? A random assemblage of scary images that had no deeper meaning? But nightmares usually change, vary, evolve over time. My sister's nightmare was consistent, the same basic story night after night for years. Was this something she had been exposed to that we were not aware of? Some media or conversation or experience that had imprinted itself on her young mind? We investigated every possibility we could think of and found nothing that would explain this specific dream content. Or was this as impossible and as contradictory to everything we thought we understood about death and consciousness as it seemed actually a memory? A memory of a previous life, a previous death, a previous family that my sister had lost when a boat sank and everyone aboard drowned. I want to be clear that neither my mother nor I were particularly spiritual or religious people. We did not have strong beliefs about reincarnation or past lives or the continuation of consciousness after death. We had not raised my sister with any framework that would have given her the concepts or vocabulary to talk about old families or previous existences. But we also could not explain what she was telling us using any conventional understanding of where dreams come from, or what children this age are capable of imagining. The theory of reincarnation, the idea that consciousness or souls or whatever you want to call, the essence of a person can be reborn into new bodies, exists in many religious and philosophical traditions around the world. Hinduism and Buddhism have elaborate frameworks for understanding how this process works. Various Western philosophers and spiritual traditions have explored similar ideas, and there is actually a body of research conducted by people with legitimate academic credentials at respected universities that has documented cases of young children who appear to have memories of previous lives. Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia spent decades collecting and studying cases where children made statements about previous lives that could be verified, where they knew details about people and places they had never been exposed to in their current life. Many of these cases involved children who had memories of dying traumatic deaths in their previous lives, drowning, being killed in accidents or violence, dying suddenly and unexpectedly in ways that would leave psychological trauma that might carry over into a new incarnation. And many of these children, like my sister, had their past life memories manifest as nightmares or fears that dominated their early childhood, and then faded as they got older and became more established in their current identity in life. I did not know about any of this research when my sister was having her nightmares. I learned about it later when I started trying to find explanations for what she had experienced and what she had told us. But discovering this body of work, reading case after case of children who had experiences similar to my sister's, gave me a framework for understanding that we were not alone, that what seemed impossible and crazy to us was actually a documented phenomenon that had been studied seriously by people whose careers depended on being careful and accurate in their research. After my sister was finally able to describe her nightmare to me and to our mother, after we had questioned her as much as we could and tried to understand what she was experiencing, something shifted. The nightmares became less frequent. Instead of waking up crying every single night, she would have several nights of peaceful sleep before the nightmare would return. And when it did return, it seemed less intense, less terrifying, as if whatever power it had held over her was beginning to fade. This continued for several more months, the nightmares spacing out further and further, happening once a week, then once every few weeks, then maybe once a month. And each time they occurred, my sister seemed less affected by them, more able to shake off the fear and go back to sleep without needing to be held or comforted for long periods. And then, at some point that I cannot pinpoint exactly because the transition was so gradual, the nightmares stopped entirely. My sister simply stopped having the dream about the sinking boat and her old family. She slept peacefully through the night, night after night, with no more tears or terror or need to climb into my bed for safety. This is apparently a common pattern in cases of children who have past life memories. The memories are most vivid and most troubling in very early childhood, when the child is still close to whatever transition brought them from their previous life into their current one. But as the child gets older, as they become more integrated into their current family and identity, as their current life experiences begin to outweigh and overlay whatever memories they might have carried from before, those past life memories fade. Eventually, for most children, the memories disappear entirely. They become integrated into the current personality, no longer accessible to conscious recall, filed away in whatever part of the psyche holds experiences and identities that are no longer active or relevant. My sister appears to have followed this pattern exactly. The nightmares that had plagued her from infancy gradually diminished in frequency and intensity as she got older, and eventually stopped completely, leaving her with normal, peaceful sleep and no apparent memory of the trauma that had once dominated her nights. I did not talk to her about the nightmares for a long time after they stopped. I did not want to remind her of something frightening, did not want to potentially trigger the dreams to return by bringing them back to her conscious awareness. I let her move on with her childhood, let her grow and develop and become the person she was going to be without dwelling on this strange chapter of her early life. But a few months ago, when my sister was 11 years old, mature enough to handle a serious conversation and old enough to have perspective on her own childhood, I asked her about the nightmares. I described what she used to tell me. The boat, the sinking, the old family. I asked if she remembered any of this, if she had any recollection of those years when she woke up crying every night, or of the content of the dreams that had frightened her so badly. She told me she does not remember any of it. Not the nightmares, not describing them to me, not the years of waking up terrified. That entire chapter of her early childhood has been forgotten, or perhaps more accurately, has become inaccessible to her conscious memory. This erasure of the memories is apparently also typical in past life cases. Children who have vivid recollections and strong emotional reactions to past life. Memories in early childhood almost universally lose access to those memories as they get older. By the time they are teenagers or adults, most of them have no recall at all of having ever talked about previous lives or previous families or previous deaths. So I am left with my own memories of what my sister said and experienced, and with the questions that those memories raise about consciousness and death and whether any of us have lived before or will live again. Did my little sister dream of a past life that ended on a sinking ship? I believe she did. I believe that the nightmares that tormented her from infancy were not random constructions of an overactive imagination, but were actual memories of a traumatic death, of drowning as a boat went down, of losing a family to the sea. I cannot prove this. I have no way to verify whether my sister ever lived before or whether the family she described as her old family actually existed. I do not know when or where this sinking might have occurred. Do not know if there is any historical record of a shipwreck that matches the time frame that would be necessary for my sister to be the reincarnation of someone who died in that disaster. But I know what she told me. I know that a child barely old enough to speak gave a consistent, detailed description of dying on a sinking boat with a family that was not her current family. I know that this nightmare was not something she had been exposed to through media or stories or any other external source we could identify. I know that the nightmare faded as she got older, following the exact pattern documented in research on children with past life memories. And I know that my sister now has no memory of any of this, has moved on completely from whatever trauma or memory was haunting her in early childhood, is living a normal 11-year-old life with no apparent connection to or awareness of whatever previous existence she might have had. So what does this mean? What am I supposed to conclude from this experience? I think it means that consciousness is more complex than we generally acknowledge, that death may not be the absolute end that we assume it is, that the essence of who we are might persist in some form beyond the death of the physical body and might, under certain circumstances, be reborn into a new life with fragments of memory from the old life still intact. I think it means that my sister, in some form, in some previous incarnation, lived before, had a family before, died in a traumatic way on a sinking boat surrounded by people she loved who were also dying. And that trauma was so powerful, so deeply imprinted on whatever part of her continued after that death, that it followed her into her next life as nightmares that dominated her early childhood. I think it means that as my sister grew and developed in her current life, as she formed attachments to me and to our mother, as she built a new identity and new memories, and a new sense of self, the old memories faded. They served their purpose, perhaps, of processing the trauma from the previous life, of integrating that experience into a larger continuity of existence. And once that processing was complete, once the trauma had been acknowledged and worked through, even if only in the form of nightmares, the memories were no longer necessary and were allowed to fade into whatever part of us holds things we no longer need to consciously access. This is what I believe. This is how I make sense of what my sister experienced and what she told me. I understand that this challenges conventional Western understanding of death and consciousness.
I understand that many people will read this and think I am being foolish or superstitious, or that I am misinterpreting normal childhood nightmares as something more significant than they actually were.
But I was there. I heard what my sister said. I saw the terror in her face night after night for years. I watched the nightmares fade as she got older. I asked her about it years later and confirmed that she has no memory of any of it. And I have read the research, the documented cases of children around the world who have had similar experiences, who have made statements about previous lives that were verified to be accurate, who knew things they had no normal way of knowing, who carried fears and phobias and traumas from deaths they never experienced in their current bodies. My sister is not unique. Her experience, while strange and unsettling to those of us who witnessed it, fits a pattern that has been documented many times, that has been studied seriously by researchers who have no agenda other than understanding what is actually happening when young children talk about old families and previous lives. So I am telling this story not to convince anyone of anything, but simply to share what happened, to add one more case to the collection of experiences that suggest consciousness is stranger and more persistent than we typically assume, and to honor my sister's experience even though she herself no longer remembers it. She woke up screaming every night from before she could talk until she was several years old. She told me she was on a sinking boat with her old family.
She said these people were her family, but that they were not me and our mother. And then the nightmares faded and disappeared, and she forgot they ever happened. Did she dream of a past life?
I believe she did.
I believe my sister died before, drowned on a sinking ship, and carried that trauma into her next life where it manifested as nightmares until she was old enough and established enough in her current existence that the memories could finally be released. I cannot prove it, but I believe it. And I carry this belief with me as I watch my sister grow into the person she is now, knowing that she is more than just the 11 years she has lived in this particular body, that she carries within her a history that extends beyond her current birth, that she has survived at least one death already, and will probably survive this one too when the time comes. The boat sank. The old family drowned, and my sister was reborn, given another chance, another family, another life to live. The nightmares were her way of processing and releasing the trauma of that previous death. And now that the processing is complete, she is free to live this life fully, without the weight of those old memories dragging her down. That is what I believe. That is what I witnessed. That is the story of my little sister and her old family and the boat that sank with everyone she loved aboard. She doesn't remember it anymore, but I do. And I am telling it now so that it is not lost, so that her experience is documented, so that anyone else who has a child with nightmares about drowning or dying or old families knows they are not alone, knows this is a real phenomenon, knows there might be more to their child's distress than random bad dreams. Listen to what children say. Take their strange statements seriously. Consider the possibility that they might be remembering rather than imagining. And understand that if they are carrying trauma from a previous life, the best thing you can do is let them talk about it. Let them process it. Let them work through it until the memories fade naturally and they can move forward with their current existence. That is what we did for my sister. We listened. We took her seriously. We provided comfort and safety while she processed whatever she was experiencing. And eventually the trauma resolved itself and she was free. She was on a boat with her old family and the boat was sinking and everyone was dying. But she survived. She came back. She found a new family. And now she is 11 years old with no memory of drowning, living a happy childhood, carrying within her a history that she cannot access, but that shaped the first years of her current life. That is my sister's story. That is what she told me when she finally had words to describe her nightmares. And that is why I believe that death is not the end, that consciousness continues, and that some of us have lived before and will live again. Because I heard it from my sister's own mouth, when she was too young to lie or make up stories or have any agenda, other than trying to explain why she was so scared every night. She remembered her old family. She remembered the boat sinking. She remembered drowning. And then she forgot and moved on and became who she is now. But I remember. And I am telling her story so that it is not lost, so that she will know someday what she experienced in those early years, even though she cannot access those memories now. This is what happened.
This is what she said. This is what I believe.
My sister dreamed of a past life that ended on a sinking ship.
And then she woke up and was reborn and became the person I know and love today. The old family is gone, but she survived. And she is here now, living this life free from the nightmares that once consumed her nights. That is the truth. That is my sister's story. And that is why I will always believe that we are more than just these bodies, more than just these single lifetimes, more than just the memories we can consciously access. Because my sister remembered, even if only for a little while, even if only in nightmares, even if she has forgotten now. She remembered her old family, and she told me about them, and I will never forget what she said.
Next one stories start now. The night something wore my sister's face, I never planned to write this down. For years, I told myself it was better left buried, locked away in that part of my memory, where I keep the things that are too heavy to carry around every day.
I've only ever spoken about this with the people who were there,
The ones who lived through it alongside me, because they are the only ones who would ever truly believe me. Everyone else would smile politely and find a rational explanation. Everyone else would say I was young, that I misremembered, that fear can make the mind do strange things. Maybe they are right. Maybe fear does strange things to the mind. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that when I touched my sister's hand that night, it did not feel like touching someone who was alive. I didn't understand that feeling when I was a child. I had no frame of reference for it. It was until years later, standing beside a casket at a funeral, reaching out to hold the hand of someone I loved who had passed, that the memory hit me like a freight train. Because the temperature was identical. The stillness was identical. The way it felt wrong in a deep, wordless, gut-level way that was identical too. That was the moment I stopped questioning what I had witnessed as a child. This is that story. I want to be clear before I say anything else. I am keeping everything deliberately vague. I am not sharing names, locations, or details that could connect this back to me or my family. The people involved in this night are real people with real lives, and they did not ask to be made into a story on the internet. My sister especially has spent years trying to move past what happened to her. The last thing she needs is strangers dissecting the worst night of her life in a comment section. So if you're looking for receipts or verifiable details, I don't have anything to offer you. What I have is memory, vivid, persistent, and deeply uncomfortable memory, and I am sharing it now because carrying it alone has gotten heavy. I was very young when this happened. Young enough that the world still felt mostly safe, that I still believed my parents could fix anything, that monsters were fictional, and the dark was just the dark. But I was also old enough to form clear memories. Old enough to understand, even without the right words for it, that something was profoundly wrong that night. Some things bypass language entirely and just carve themselves directly into you. This was one of those things. My family is Christian. We believe in God, we believe in prayer, we believe in scripture, and yes, we believe in the reality of spiritual warfare. I understand that for a lot of people, that framework sounds like mythology. I'm not here to debate theology with anyone. I'm just telling you where I come from and how I understand what I saw. You can interpret it however you want. You weren't there. We were living at the time in a house where the living room and the kitchen shared one continuous open space. There was no wall dividing them, just a shift from carpet to tile that marked where one room ended and the other began. We had an old family desktop computer set up in the living room, close to the television. It was the kind of bulky machine that sat on a desk in the corner and took several minutes to load anything, but it worked, and in those days that was enough. It was evening. Both of my parents were home. My siblings and I were all in that shared living space doing various things, nothing unusual, nothing memorable. It was the kind of ordinary night that you wouldn't think twice about. The kind of night you would never be able to pick out from 100 other ordinary nights unless something happened to make it unforgettable. Something happened. My oldest sister was on the computer. She had found one of those videos that were everywhere on the internet at a certain point in time, the ones that start out calm and quiet, showing you something mundane, luring you into letting your guard down, and then exploding with a sudden screaming face designed to make you jump out of your skin. Scare videos. Jump scare compilations. They were passed around constantly, and finding new people to show them to was part of the fun.
My oldest sister thought it was hilarious. She called me over first. I watched it. I got startled the way everyone gets startled, that involuntary full-body flinch, the sharp intake of breath, the half-second of pure animal fear before your brain catches up and tells you it's just a video. Then I laughed, because that's what you do. And I went back to what I had been doing. It was nothing. It was exactly what it appeared to be. A stupid prank video designed to make you jump. Then my oldest sister called over another one of my sisters. She didn't warn her. She just called her over like she had something to show her, like it was going to be interesting. And my sister walked over and leaned in to look at the screen. I wasn't watching them directly when it happened. I wasn't paying close attention. I was somewhere else in that open space, doing something else, only vaguely aware of my sisters at the computer behind me.
So I didn't see my sister's face when she watched the video.
I didn't see the moment it played. The first thing I knew was the sound. She screamed. And I need you to understand, I grew up with siblings. I know the difference between a scream of surprise and a scream of genuine terror. I know the difference between someone being startled and someone being afraid. This was not a laugh that turned into a scream. This was not the normal reaction to a jump scare. The moment that sound left her body, something in the room changed. Something shifted in the air, the way pressure shifts before a storm. Every person in that open space felt it. I turned around because I had to. Because my body turned before my brain gave it instructions. My sister was shaking. Not trembling the way you might tremble when something frightens you. Not the kind of shaking that passes in a few seconds when the adrenaline settles. She was shaking uncontrollably, and there was something about the way she was standing, or trying to stand, that looked wrong. Like she was fighting to hold herself upright. Like something was pulling on her from the inside. My mom reached her first. She crossed that room faster than I had ever seen her move and wrapped her arms around my sister, holding her, asking what was wrong. My dad was right behind her, and he was not calm the way he usually was. He was loud. He was demanding to know what she had been shown, what had happened, why she was reacting like this. My oldest sister was frozen at the computer, and the atmosphere in the room had gone from ordinary to terrifying in the span of about 30 seconds. My sister could not really answer. She kept shaking. And then, and this is the part that made my mother's face go white, my sister went limp.
Not the way you go limp when you relax. Not the way you go limp when you sit down and let your body rest. She went limp the way a puppet goes limp when someone drops the strings. Her arms fell to her sides. Her whole body seemed to lose its structure, and the only thing holding her up was my mother's grip. And my mother's face in that moment, I have carried that image for my entire life, because I had never seen my mother look like that. My mother was the person who made everything okay. My mother was steady and capable and unshakable. And in that moment, she looked like she was looking at something that terrified her down to the bone. She called our pastor. It was late at night, and she called him anyway, and she told him we needed to come see him immediately. There was no discussion about whether it could wait until morning. There was no back and forth. My dad went to get the car ready, and my mom sent me into one of the bedrooms with my sister. And so I found myself sitting on the edge of a bed next to her, trying to figure out what to do. I was a child. I did what children do when they don't know how to help. I held her hand. I sat next to her and I held her hand and I told her it was going to be okay. I remember saying it quietly, almost whispering it, like you would whisper to someone you were trying not to startle. It's okay. Everything is going to be okay. I'm not sure I believed it, but it felt like the right thing to say. And that is when I first felt it, the cold. Her hand was cold. But not cold the way hands get cold when you've been outside, or when the air conditioning is running too high, or when someone has poor circulation. This was something different. This was a cold that seemed to come from somewhere inside her, radiating outward. And it did not feel like the cold of a living body that had gotten chilly. It felt like the absence of warmth. It felt like warmth had never been there. I did not know how to name that feeling when I was a child. I held her hand and I told her it was going to be okay, and I tried to ignore the way the cold crawled up my fingers and into my palm. I was scared in a way I couldn't fully understand yet. Scared in a way that was different from being scared of the dark, or scared of getting in trouble, or scared of something hurting you. This was a quieter kind of fear, a deeper one.
I was holding her hand, watching her, waiting for something I didn't even know what I was waiting for when she moved. She turned her head. Fast. The kind of fast that doesn't look quite voluntary, the kind of fast that snaps rather than turns. And she looked directly at me. Her eyes were black, not dark brown, not dilated, not bloodshot or glazed or unfocused in the way that eyes look when someone is in shock or ill. They were black, completely, fully, deeply black from edge to edge. The whites of her eyes were gone. Whatever light was in the room was not reflecting back from them the way it should have. I have thought about that moment thousands of times in my life. I have tried every rational explanation I could think of. I have wondered if I was misremembering. I have wondered if the lighting was dim and I was scared and my brain filled in something that wasn't there. I have sat with all of those possibilities honestly and carefully. And I always come back to the same thing. I know what I saw. I was close enough to see it clearly. The room was lit. I was looking directly at her. Her eyes were black. But what I remember even more clearly than the visual was the feeling. When she looked at me, I felt something that I still do not have perfect words for. It was a sense of looking at something that was not my sister and simultaneously knowing that my sister was still in there somewhere. Like the difference between a house being empty and a house having someone in it. Her face was her face. Her features were her features. But what was looking at me from behind those eyes was not the person I had grown up with. It was something else. Something that was using her face the way you would use a door. I did not scream. I don't know why. I think I was too scared to make noise. I think some part of me understood without being told that making noise would not help anything. I sat very still and I held her hand and I looked back at her. And then my parents were there and it was time to go. We drove to the church in the dark. I remember that drive in pieces, the silence in the car, the way the streetlights passed over the windows. My parents in the front seats not saying much. I don't know what my sister was doing in those minutes. I was not looking at her. I was looking out the window and trying to hold on to the feeling of ordinary things, streetlights, roads, the sound of the engine, because the ordinary world felt very thin that night, like a layer of paper stretched over something vast and dark. The church was empty when we arrived, the way churches are empty late at night, all that open space and stained glass and silence. A teenager who was there for some reason tried to help. He came over to my sister and gently touched her hands, the way you would reach out to someone who seemed distressed, trying to offer some kind of comfort. And my sister looked at him. He backed away. He didn't say anything. He just backed away and went to find the pastor. I have wondered about that teenager many times. I have wondered what he saw when she looked at him. I have wondered if he ever talked about that night, if he still remembers it, if it stayed with him the way it stayed with me. He was old enough to understand more than I was, and whatever he saw made him step backward without explanation and leave the room. That tells me something. The pastor came. They brought us into the main area of the church, the sanctuary, the big open space with the pews and the altar, and my parents sat me down behind my father and told me that everything was going to be fine. I was young, and they were trying to protect me. I understood even then that everything was not going to be fine, or at least that it wasn't fine yet. But I sat where I was told to sit. What happened next is both the clearest and the hardest part to write about. The pastor and the other people who had come stood around my sister and they began to pray. But this was not quiet, bowed head, hands folded prayer. This was something I had never seen before and have only seen a few times since. They were speaking directly at whatever was inside her. They were rebuking it. They were calling it out by what it was and commanding it to leave in the name of God. And there was authority in the way they were speaking that was different from normal speech, more like an order being issued than a request being made. For a few moments, nothing happened. And then my sister started screaming. I have heard a lot of sounds in my life. I have heard people in pain, people in grief, people in shock, people terrified. I know what my sister's voice sounds like. I have heard her laugh and cry and yell and whisper for my entire life. The sound that came out of her body was not her voice. It was deep in a way that her voice had never been deep. It was distorted in a way that did not sound like a technical distortion, not like a recording being played at the wrong speed or audio being run through an effect. It sounded like something that had taken her voice and dragged it through something dark and wrong before letting it out. And it was loud.
Not just loud in terms of volume, but loud in a way that seemed to fill the entire building, to bounce off the walls and the high ceiling and come back at you from multiple directions. She screamed, "It hurts, over and over in that voice that was not her voice. Then my father picked me up. He put his body between me and what was happening and told me not to look. He held me close and told me it was okay. The same thing I had told my sister Datcher. In the bedroom, and I clung to him and buried my face against his shoulder. And then I looked anyway. I don't know why. Maybe it was the same impulse that makes people slow down to look at accidents. Maybe it was because not seeing felt more frightening than seeing. Maybe it was because I needed to know. Even at that age, even as scared as I was. I turned my head and I looked past my father's shoulder. My sister was on the floor. She was moving, but not the way people move when they fall. Not the way people move when they are in pain and trying to get up or get comfortable. She was moving in ways that human bodies are not designed to move, twitching in directions that joints don't bend. Her body seemed disconnected from intention, from will, from the normal relationship between a mind and the body it lives in. She was crawling, but the crawling looked wrong, the angles were wrong, the rhythm was wrong. The whole thing looked like someone was operating her body without quite understanding how it worked. I pressed my face back against my father's shoulder. I held on to him as tightly as I have ever held on to anything. I was completely frozen inside, not frozen like being cold, but frozen the way water freezes. Everything that had been moving suddenly stopped and locked in place. The screaming continued. The prayers continued. The deep, wrong voice continued saying that it hurt. And then gradually, and then all at once it stopped. I don't remember the exact moment it ended. I remember the screaming fading. I remember the voices of the pastor and the others coming back into focus. Still praying, but with a different tone now. Quieter. Less like a battle and more like an aftermath. I remember being set down by my father and looking across the room at my sister. She was sitting on the floor. She was crying, real crying, her face, her voice, the way she held herself. She was shaking, but differently than before. Before, the shaking had been something being done to her. Now it was her own body processing what had just happened to it. She looked completely exhausted, like someone who had run until they could not take another step. She looked small. My mother went to her immediately and held her. The pastor was speaking quietly. The others were still praying softly. My father kept his hand on my shoulder, and I stood very still and watched my sister cry in my mother's arms and felt something slowly begin to return to the room. Something like warmth. Something like ordinary air. Something like the world being what it was supposed to be again. We went home.
Everyone was quiet on the drive back. And then, in the way that families sometimes handle things that are too large and too strange to process, no one talked about it again. That silence lasted for years. It was not a hostile silence or a deliberate erasure. It was more like the way you don't talk about something because talking about it means looking directly at it. And looking directly at it is more than anyone is ready to do. We all carried it separately. We all went back to ordinary life. We went to school and church and family dinners, and the world kept turning the way it always had. And what had happened that night stayed in a corner of each of us where it was not quite dark enough to forget, but not quite light enough to discuss. Eventually, when I was older, I asked my sister. I had carried my version of that night for long enough, and I needed to know what it had looked like from the inside. I needed to hear her account, not to check if it matched mine, but because she was the one who had been at the center of it, and I owed it to her and to myself to finally ask. She told me that when she watched the video, she felt something enter her body. That is the word she used. Enter. Not that she was scared. Not that she was overwhelmed. Something entered her body the moment the video played. She described it as an immediate physical sensation of intrusion, something crossing a threshold that should not have been crossed. After that, everything went dark for her. She described it as watching herself from somewhere outside, like standing behind glass in a room and watching everything happen to someone who looked exactly like her. She was aware of everything, aware of the room, aware of our parents, aware of what was happening, but she was not in control. She was a passenger in her own body, watching something else drive. She told me that when she turned her head and looked at me in the bedroom, the moment with the black eyes, the moment that has never left me, she was terrified.
She said whatever was inside her had noticed me. She could feel its attention turning in my direction, and she was fighting with everything she had against it, trying to redirect it, trying to keep it from reaching toward me. She said she was screaming on the inside in those seconds, even though her body was silent. She told me that during the time at the church, she could hear the prayers. She could hear the pastor. She said the prayers felt like pressure against something inside her, not painful for her, but clearly painful for what had taken up residence in her. When the screaming happened, when that deep and wrong voice tore out of her throat, she said she was not the one making the sound. She was listening to it happen the same way I was listening to it from across the room. She was aware that it was her body producing it, and simultaneously had no control over it whatsoever. When it ended, she said it was like a door slamming shut. 1 second she was outside herself, watching. The next second she was back, fully back, completely back, in her own body, in her own skin. She said it was like waking up from a dream, except she remembered everything. Every second of it. The exhaustion was total. She said she felt like she had been wrung out like a washcloth, like every ounce of energy had been taken from her and she was just an empty container sitting on the church floor. She told me that for a long time after that night, she was afraid to sleep, afraid to be alone, afraid to watch anything on a screen.
She said she still doesn't fully understand why the video was a trigger for what happened, whether it was just the context or the specific content or something else entirely. She said she doesn't want to understand it badly enough to think about it more than she has to. The last thing she said to me about it was that it was the worst experience of her life. She said it without drama or exaggeration, the way you state a fact. And then she changed the subject, and we have not spoken about it in detail since. I've had a lot of years to sit with this. I've been through phases of trying to explain it scientifically. Phases of researching the psychology of hysteria and mass panic, and how trauma affects memory. Phases of wondering if my whole family had somehow shared a collective misinterpretation of something that had a perfectly ordinary cause. I've been through those phases genuinely, not as a performance of open-mindedness, but because I wanted to be honest with myself. I did not want to just believe the scary thing. I wanted to know the true thing. The honest result of all that sitting with it is this. I cannot explain what happened that night in any framework that does not include the possibility of something beyond ordinary material reality. I have tried every other framework. None of them accounts for all of what I saw and felt and heard. None of them accounts for my sister's account from the inside. None of them accounts for what that teenager saw in her face that made him step backward without a word. None of them accounts for what was in her eyes when she looked at me in that bedroom, or the cold that was not a living cold, or the voice that came out of her body and did not belong to her. As a Christian, I believe what I believe. I believe there are spiritual realities that exist alongside the physical world that we navigate every day, and that on that night in that house, something from one of those realities crossed over in a way it should not have. I believe the prayers drove it out. I believe my sister is free of it. I believe God was present in that church in a way that was more powerful than whatever had come in through that screen. But even if you do not share my faith, even if every spiritual and religious element of my interpretation sounds like mythology to you, there are still things that happened that night that I cannot give you a clean explanation for. The temperature of her skin, the color of her eyes, the sound of that voice, the way her body moved, my sister's testimony about what she experienced from inside it, the teenager who stepped away without saying a word. Those things happened. I was there. I am not a person given to exaggeration or fantasy. I am not writing this for attention or engagement or to go viral. I am writing it because it happened and it has been inside me for my whole life, and there is a certain kind of weight that you can only set down by finally saying the thing out loud to more than the small circle of people who were there. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I know what it sounded like and what it looked like and what the air felt like in that church when whatever it was finally left. I don't expect you to believe me. I am not trying to convince you of anything. I am just telling you what happened one ordinary evening in a house where the living room and the kitchen shared one open space, where a scare video played on an old computer in the corner, and where something that was not a reaction to a jump scare walked into my sister and had to be driven out by prayer in an empty church late at night.
I am telling you because I was there. And because after everything, after all the years and all the attempts to explain it, and all the heavy silence that still feels like enough of a reason.
Last one story start now.
The shaman said an elderly woman died in our closet. And I had been staring at it all night, feeling like something was watching me. I threw up after spending hours staring at my parents' closet, feeling like something was gazing back at me from the darkness. And 3 days later, a shaman told my family that an elderly woman had died in that exact closet and was claiming the house as her own. That is the moment when everything clicked into place. When all the strange experiences and creepy feelings and unexplained events that had been happening in our house suddenly had a source and a reason. And when my parents realized that we could not stay in that home for another day longer than absolutely necessary. The thing I had felt watching me from the closet was not my imagination. The dark figure I had seen standing at the edge of my brother's bed was not a trick of shadows. The eerie, oppressive feeling that filled the hallway and made all of us run through it rather than walk was not just childhood fear amplified by an active imagination. There was something in that house with us. Someone who had died there, who had never left, who considered the space her own and resented our presence in what she still thought of as her home. This happened in the year 2000, which means I was very young when we lived in that haunted house. Young enough that some of my memories from that time are fragmentary and incomplete, but old enough that the fear I experienced has stayed with me clearly across all the years since. Some experiences burn themselves into your memory with such intensity that age and time cannot erode them. And living in a house with a hostile spirit who died in your parents' closet and watched you while you slept is definitely that kind of experience. I need to tell you this story from the beginning, from before I knew the house was haunted, from when we first moved in and everything seemed normal, and we had no idea what we were about to experience in that place. My family moved into the house sometime in 1999 or early 2000. I cannot remember the exact timing because I was so young, but I know we lived there for long enough that multiple strange incidents occurred. Long enough that the haunting was not just a single event, but a pattern of experiences that accumulated until they could no longer be ignored or explained away. The house itself was not particularly old or decrepit. Not the kind of stereotypical haunted house you see in movies with peeling paint and broken windows and an obvious aura of wrongness. It was a regular suburban or semi-rural home, the kind of place that thousands of families live in all across America without incident. There was nothing about its external appearance that would have warned us what we were moving into. But from very early on, there was something wrong with the hallway. I cannot tell you exactly what made the hallway feel wrong because it was not anything you could point to or measure or photograph. It was a feeling, an atmosphere, a quality of the space that made everyone in the family uncomfortable. We all hated going through that hallway. Every single one of us, my parents and all my siblings, felt it independently without discussing it or comparing notes at first. The hallway connected the main living areas of the house to the bedrooms. It was not particularly long or dark or unusual in its architecture. It was just a hallway, a transitional space that you had to pass through multiple times a day to get from one part of the house to another. But it felt wrong, creepy, eerie, like something was watching you when you passed through it. Like you were intruding on space that did not want you there. We all dealt with this feeling the same way without ever discussing it. We ran. Instead of walking normally through the hallway the way you would walk through any other part of your home, we would move through it as quickly as possible, almost sprinting, trying to minimize the time we spent in that space. Even my parents did this, though they probably would not have admitted it at the time. Probably told themselves they were just in a hurry or had somewhere to be, rather than acknowledging that they were uncomfortable in their own hallway. The day when everything started to escalate, when the haunting moved from vague, uncomfortable feelings to specific, undeniable experiences, started normally enough. My sisters and I were watching television in the living room. This was a completely ordinary activity, the kind of thing we did countless times without incident. We were relaxed, engaged with whatever show was on, not thinking about ghosts or hauntings or anything supernatural. I needed to use the restroom. Again, completely normal. A bodily function that requires no special explanation or context. I told one of my sisters where I was going, got up from where I had been sitting, and headed toward the bathroom, which meant I had to go through the hallway.
I ran, as I always did, moving quickly through that space that made all of us uncomfortable. But this time, as I passed through the hallway with its slight turn in the middle, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There was a dark figure standing at the edge of my older brother's bed. Not a person. Not someone I recognized. Not my brother or any member of my family. A silhouette, a shape, a dark form that was clearly visible against the lighter background of the room. Tall, probably the height of an adult, standing motionless in a position where no one should have been standing. I stopped immediately, my brain trying to process what I was seeing, trying to make sense of a figure that should not have been there. I stared at it for just a second, maybe two, long enough to register that I was definitely seeing something, that this was not just a trick of peripheral vision or a shadow cast by an object I was misinterpreting. And then I looked again, focused my eyes more directly on the spot where the figure had been standing. It was gone. Completely gone. The space was empty. My brother's bedroom looked exactly as it always looked, with no dark figure standing at the edge of the bed. I stood there in the hallway feeling my heart pounding, trying to decide what I had just seen and whether I should tell anyone about it, or just try to convince myself I had imagined it. But I knew I had not imagined it. The figure had been real, solid, visible for those few seconds before it disappeared. I continued to the bathroom, used it, and then ran back through the hallway even faster than usual, not wanting to spend any more time in that space than absolutely necessary. I did not tell my sisters what I had seen. I do not remember why I kept it to myself. Maybe I was afraid they would make fun of me. Maybe I was trying to convince myself it was not real. Maybe I just wanted to forget about it and pretend it had not happened. Whatever the reason, I stayed quiet about the dark figure at the edge of my brother's bed. That same day, later that night, something even more disturbing happened. I was very young at the time, young enough that I still slept in my parents' bedroom rather than in my own room. This is normal for small children, common in many families, and I thought nothing of it. My parents' bedroom felt safe. It was where the adults were. It was where I could sleep without fear. Except that night I could not sleep without fear, because I kept having a feeling that something was in the closet. My parents' bedroom had a closet, a standard feature in most bedrooms used for storing clothes and shoes and whatever other items people keep in closets. During the day, with the door closed or even open, it was just a closet, completely ordinary, nothing to be afraid of. But that night, lying in bed in the dark, I kept looking at the closet and feeling like something was inside it. Not just something in the sense of stored items. Something alive or something that had been alive, something that was aware and watching. Something that was staring at me. I would close my eyes, try to ignore the feeling, try to fall asleep. But the sensation of being watched would not go away. It was so strong, so insistent that I could not help but look. And each time I looked at the closet, the feeling intensified. The certainty that something was in there, gazing out at me through the darkness, paying very close attention to me in a way that felt malevolent or at least deeply wrong. This went on for what felt like hours. Me lying in bed, feeling watched, looking at the closet, feeling the intensity of whatever presence was focusing on me from inside that space. My young mind did not have the vocabulary or the conceptual framework to understand what I was experiencing, but my body knew that something was very wrong. My stress response was activated. My heart was beating fast. My stomach was churning with anxiety and fear. And then I threw up. I do not know if the vomiting was a direct physical response to the fear and stress I was experiencing, or if it was something more, some kind of reaction to the presence itself, to being in close proximity to something that should not have been there. But I threw up, and the vomiting woke my parents, and they had to get up in the middle of the night to clean me up and change the bedding and take care of me. They probably assumed I had gotten sick from something I ate, or that I had a stomach bug, or that this was just one of those random childhood illnesses that happen without warning. I do not remember if I told them about the feeling of being watched from the closet. I might have been too young or too scared to articulate it. Or I might have told them and they dismissed it as a bad dream or an overactive imagination. Either way, the night was disrupted and unpleasant for everyone, and I spent the rest of it feeling deeply unsettled even after I was cleaned up and back in bed. A couple of days later,
Something happened that finally made my parents take seriously the possibility that
Something was wrong with the house beyond normal childhood fears or overactive imaginations.
my mother had an experience in the garage. I do not know the details of what she experienced because I was not there, and she has never fully described it to me.
But whatever happened spooked her badly. Frightened her in a way that was unusual for my mother, who was generally a practical, level-headed person not given to panic or exaggeration. Whatever she saw or felt or experienced in that garage was serious enough that she decided we needed help. Not medical help, not psychological help, but spiritual help. She called a shaman to come to our house and perform a cleansing. For readers who may not be familiar, a shaman in this context is a spiritual practitioner who works with spirits and energies, who can perceive things that most people cannot perceive, and who has the training and the tools to cleanse spaces of negative or unwanted spiritual presences. Different cultures have different names for these practitioners, and different methods for what they do. But the basic concept is consistent across many traditions.
The shaman came to our house. I do not remember what the cleansing ceremony involved, what rituals were performed, or what implements were used. I was young and was probably kept away from most of it.
Either because my parents thought I was too young to participate or because the shaman preferred to work without children present.
But after the cleansing was completed, the shaman spoke with my parents. And I, being a curious child who wanted to know what the adults were talking about, was eavesdropping on their conversation. What I heard has stayed with me for more than 20 years. The shaman told my parents, "This place isn't safe for you and your family." That alone was frightening enough. A spiritual authority figure, someone my parents had trusted enough to bring into our home, was telling them that our house was not safe. Not just uncomfortable, not just a little bit haunted, but actually unsafe.
A place where we should not be living. But the shaman continued providing details that made everything so much worse.
An elderly woman died in this home. She says this is her home. An elderly woman. Dead. Still present in the house. Still claiming ownership of the space. Still considering it her home despite the fact that her physical life had ended, and a new family was now living there. And then the shaman said the words that connected everything I had experienced. That explained the feeling of being watched from the closet. That made me understand why I had felt so wrong and so sick that night. She died in the closet. The closet. The same closet I had been staring at all night while feeling like something was watching me. The same closet in my parents' bedroom where I slept every night. The same closet that now had an explanation for the dread and the nausea and the overwhelming sense of wrongness I had felt. An elderly woman had died in that closet, and she was still there, still in that space, still watching from that darkness, still making her presence known to anyone sensitive enough to feel it. I was eavesdropping on this conversation, standing somewhere I could hear but not be seen. And when I heard the shaman say she died in the closet, I lost whatever composure I had been maintaining. I started crying. Not quiet tears, but the kind of crying that comes from genuine terror. From a child's understanding that the thing they were afraid of was real and confirmed, and even worse than they had imagined. I was scared in a way that I had never been scared before, in a way that felt like it was too big for my small body to contain. My parents heard me crying and realized I had been listening. They tried to comfort me, but what comfort could they offer?
The shaman had just confirmed that our house was haunted by a woman who had died in the closet of the room where I slept. There was no way to make that less frightening or to reassure me that everything was fine when clearly everything was very much not fine. Nobody slept that night. Not me, not my parents, not my siblings. We all stayed awake, hyper-aware of every sound and shadow, feeling the presence of the dead woman in a way we could no longer ignore or rationalize away. The shaman had given a name and a story to the wrongness we had all been feeling, and now that we knew what we were dealing with, we could not unknow it. My parents made their decision very quickly. The very next day, the day after the shaman's visit and the sleepless night that followed, they started looking for a new home. They understood that we could not stay in that house, that the warning from the shaman needed to be taken seriously, that whatever presence was there was not going to leave, and we were not going to be able to live comfortably or safely in a space that a dead woman was still claiming as her own. They found a new place quickly.
I do not know if they got lucky or if they were so motivated that they took the first acceptable option they found, but within a very short time they had secured new housing and we were preparing to move. But we had to stay in the haunted house for one more night while the move was being finalized. One more night of knowing exactly what was in that closet, what was in that hallway, what was standing at the edge of my brother's bed. One more night of feeling watched and unwanted and afraid in our own home. Nobody slept that night either.
We all stayed awake, probably huddled together, counting the hours until morning when we could start the process of getting out of that place permanently.
And then we moved. Finally, blessedly, we left that house behind and moved into a new place where no one had died in the closet, where the hallways felt normal, where we could walk through our home without running and without fear. The feeling of relief was overwhelming. I remember the first night in the new house, sleeping peacefully for the first time in what felt like forever, not feeling watched, not feeling that oppressive presence, not having that instinctive fear response that had become such a constant part of living in the old house. We were free. The haunting was over. We had escaped. I want to be clear that this was not just my experience. I was not the only person in the family who encountered strange and frightening things in that house. My older siblings had their own experiences, their own encounters with whatever presence or presences were there. I was too young at the time to know all the details of what they experienced, and some of them may have kept quiet about it either to avoid scaring the younger children, or because they did not want to acknowledge what was happening. But after we moved, after we were safe, stories started to come out. My siblings shared things they had seen or felt or experienced in that house. And every story reinforced the same basic truth. That house was haunted. That presence was real. And we had all been living with something that did not want us there and made its displeasure known in ways both subtle and overt. I have thought about that house many times over the years since we moved out.
I have wondered who the elderly woman was, how she died, whether her death in the closet was peaceful or traumatic or something in between. I have wondered why she stayed in that house after dying, why she could not or would not move on to whatever comes next, why she felt such a strong attachment to that physical space that she continued to claim it as her own even in death. I have wondered if she was angry at us for living in her house, if she was trying to drive us out deliberately through the fear and discomfort she created, or if she was simply present and unaware of how her presence affected living people. I have wondered what happened to the next family who moved into that house after we left.
Did they experience the same haunting? Did they feel the same oppressive presence in the hallway and the same watchful gaze from the closet? Did they also end up calling a shaman or priest or some other spiritual authority to cleanse the space? Or did they somehow avoid triggering the woman's attention and live there peacefully, unaware of what shared the space with them? I will probably never know the answers to these questions. The house was just one place we lived during my childhood, and we moved away and never looked back. Never maintained contact with anyone in that neighborhood. Never heard any follow-up stories about hauntings or problems with that property. But I know what we experienced. I know what I saw and felt and lived through during those months in 2000 when my family shared a home with a dead woman who had never left. And I know that the shaman's warning was accurate, that the house was not safe for us, that leaving was the right decision even though it meant disrupting our lives and moving on short notice. Some places hold on to the dead.
Some deaths leave impressions that do not fade, that continue to affect the physical spaces where they occurred long after the body has been removed and buried, and the living have tried to move on. Some spirits do not transition peacefully to whatever comes after death, but instead remain attached to places they knew in life, places they still think of as home even though they no longer have physical bodies to inhabit those spaces. The elderly woman who died in my parents' closet was one of those spirits. She stayed. She claimed the house as her own. She made her presence known to a family of living people who had moved in without knowing her story, without knowing they were sharing space with someone who had died there. And when my parents finally understood what they were dealing with, when the shaman confirmed what we had all been feeling and experiencing, they did the only thing they could do. They left. They found a new home. They got their family out of that haunted house and into a space where we could sleep peacefully and walk through hallways without running and look at closets without feeling watched.
I threw up after spending all night feeling something in the closet staring at me. And 3 days later, I learned that an elderly woman had died in that closet. And the next day, my parents started looking for a new place to live. And shortly after that, we moved out and never went back. That is my story of growing up in a haunted house. That is what I experienced in the year 2000 when I was too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to be terrified by it, and to carry the memories into adulthood. The dark figure at the edge of my brother's bed was real. The presence in the closet was real.
The elderly woman who died there and never left was real. And we escaped.
We survived. We moved on with our lives in a house where the only occupants were living people and where closets were just closets and hallways were just hallways. But I will never forget that first house, that haunted house, that place where I learned that death is not always the end, and that some people never leave the places they called home even after their bodies stop working. The shaman said she died in the closet, and I had been staring at that closet all night feeling like something was watching me back. That connection, that confirmation, that moment of understanding what I had been feeling and why, has stayed with me for more than 20 years. And I am telling this story now so that anyone else who feels watched in their home, who has children who are afraid of closets or hallways for reasons they cannot articulate, who senses a presence they cannot see, knows that they are not imagining it, and they are not crazy. Some houses are haunted. Some closets contain more than just clothes. Some hallways carry the weight of deaths that occurred in the spaces they connect. And sometimes the only solution is to leave, to find a new home, to escape the presence that claims ownership of a space you thought was yours. That is what my family did. And it saved us from months or years of continued haunting, continued fear, continued sleepless nights spent feeling watched by something that should not have been there. The elderly woman died in the closet, and she never left. And we could not stay. So we moved, and we were finally safe. And the haunting ended the day we walked out of that house for the last time. That is the truth. That is what happened.
That is my story of growing up in a haunted house in the year 2000.
I saw a dark figure at the edge of my brother's bed. I felt something watching me from the closet all night until I vomited. A shaman told us an elderly woman died in that closet and said the house was her home, and we ran. We all ran the way we had been running through that hallway from the first day we moved in. But this time, we ran out of that house forever, and we never looked back.